Marcus Washington stepped onto the bustling terminal at JFK International Airport as the early morning light revealed polished floors and the quiet hum of early travelers. He carried himself with a dignified calm that belied the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Clad in a deep navy three-piece suit and a crisp white shirt that spoke of understated elegance, Marcus held a worn black leather duffel in his left hand and his coveted first-class boarding pass in his right. The seat in question, 1A on Atlantic Flight 322 bound for Zurich, was to be his sanctuary, a retreat earned by paying full price and expecting nothing short of respect. Yet, as he strode toward the front of the cabin, his tranquil demeanor began to crack under the pressure of a slow-burning injustice that had been fanned by the careless whispers of prejudice. When Marcus reached seat Ton A, he was taken aback. There, occupying his rightful place, sat a middle-aged white man in a luxurious charcoal suit. His demeanor relaxed, as though the seat had been tailor-made just for him. The man sipped champagne and scrolled through his emails with a smug ease, seemingly unaware that his mere presence was an insult. A public declaration that his worth eclipsed that of Marcus simply because of the color of his skin. Natalie, the flight attendant with icy blonde hair and a perfunctory smile, approached Marcus and announced that his seat had been reallocated to accommodate a platinum partner of the airline. Her tone was superficially polite, yet every word dripped with condescension. Without even verifying Marcus's boarding pass or his identity, she dismissed his rightful claim to the seat and pointed him toward business class seat 7. Marcus's heart sank at this abrupt demotion. He had flown with dignity through airfields and boardrooms alike, yet today, in the gilded realm of first-class luxury, he was reduced to a second-class afterthought. The injustice was not just a simple seat change, it was an act that reduced him to a mere inconvenience in the eyes of those who valued money, influence, and archaic notions of racial hierarchy over merit and decency. Natalie's eyes, cold and calculating, betrayed an unspoken alliance with the man occupying seat 1A, a man whose identity Marcus knew all too well. Brent Hargrove, as his name was reluctantly revealed, was no ordinary traveler. A notorious venture capitalist with a past marred by scandal and vitriolic remarks about diversity, Brent's presence signified more than just preferential treatment. It was an overt display of power and privilege, a power play that underscored the deep-seated racism woven into the fabric of the airline industry. The tension in the cabin grew palpable as onlookers exchanged furtive glances and whispered comments. A hush fell over the elegant space, a silence charged with the anticipation of a conflict that was far from procedural. Marcus's eyes, dark and determined, locked onto Natalie's as he calmly requested to speak with the flight supervisor. In that moment, the friendly decorum of first-class service gave way to an undercurrent of simmering rage and wounded pride. Natalie's smile evaporated, replaced by a rehearsed professionalism that conveyed nothing but the inevitability of submission. Her insistence that Marcus move to a lesser seat without any explanation or verification laid bare an ugly truth. In this narrow world of selective priorities, his very existence was treated as an afterthought, a trivial inconvenience that needed to be excised by force if necessary. Undeterred by the coercive tactics at play, Marcus's inner resolve hardened. He could feel the weight of centuries of injustice pressing upon him, the legacy of discrimination that had plagued countless others before him. His silence, once a tribute to quiet dignity, now transformed into a battle cry against systemic oppression. With a measured calm that belied his inner fire, he reiterated, in a tone that resonated with both sorrow and unyielding defiance, that he had every right to occupy the seat he had paid for. His words, simple yet laden with the gravity of his indignation, hung in the air like a challenge to the entire establishment of prejudice. Natalie, visibly unsettled by Marcus's unwavering composure, hesitated before calling in a second attendant, Evan, a young man whose eyes betrayed a tentative hopefulness that was quickly crushed by the rigid hierarchy before him. The conflict, once an abstract notion discussed in hushed murmurs, had become a tangible, incandescent explosion of indignation and disdain. Every action, every silent exchange, was a microcosm of a larger war waged daily by those who dared to exist in spaces where privilege reigned supreme. The murmurs of the nearby passengers, some of whom had initially looked away to avoid the discomfort of confrontation, now swelled into a quiet chorus of sympathy and disapproval. As Marcus stood his ground, the air around him seemed to thicken with the enormity of the moment. The atmosphere was charged with the collective memory of past wrongs, of moments when quiet heroes had been forced to yield to injustice. This was not merely about a seat on an airplane. It was a testament to the strength of a man who refused to be diminished by a system that thrived on discrimination. And as the conflict escalated, so too did the savagery of the force unleashed by those determined to maintain the status quo. Brent Hargrove, with an air of entitlement that bordered on cruelty, interjected with a sneer that cut through the tension like a knife. His words, laced with venom and superiority, were not just an affront to Marcus's dignity. They were a declaration of a malicious order where certain lives were deemed more valuable than others. For those in the cabin who watched, the scene unfolded as a modern parable of inequity and resistance. Each word exchanged, each gesture made under duress, painted a vivid picture of a man cornered by a system that cared little for individual worth. Marcus's gentle yet firm challenge was a spark that promised retribution. He knew deep down that the injustice he faced would not go unanswered. What began as a quiet act of defiance was about to morph into an explosion of righteous retribution, a response that would shake the very foundations of the industry. His resolve was as clear as the rising sun outside the terminal. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by making a stand. No longer would he allow the sting of discrimination to silence his voice. Within moments, the cabin transformed from a showcase of first-class opulence to a battlefield of principles. The young attendant's hesitant question about the manifest was met by Natalie's curt dismissal, her words reducing his query to nothing more than an inconvenient afterthought. In that instance, the forces of indifference and arrogance were laid bare. Marcus, driven by a heart heavy with sorrow yet buoyed by a fierce desire for justice, voiced his ultimatum with the calm authority of someone who had weathered far greater storms. His challenge was clear. He would not be moved without cause, and he would not be denied the dignity that was rightfully his. As the tension reached its climax, the atmosphere in the cabin was electrified by an imminent promise of retribution. A retribution that would not only undo the wrong, but would do so on a scale so grand that even the skeptics in the crowd would be left dumbfounded. Marcus's defiance was not a moment of petty insubordination. It was a declaration of war against the pervasive forces of racism and prejudice that sought to erase his worth. For every scoff and every dismissive command, he was prepared to answer with a vengeance that was as measured as it was mighty. The seeds of revenge had been sown, and in that charged moment, the promise of an explosive reckoning hovered just at the edge of possibility, waiting for the precise moment to burst forth in a cascade of cathartic triumph. Marcus Washington was not merely a man with a boarding pass. He was a symbol of enduring strength, a beacon of hope for every soul who had ever been reduced, silenced, or dismissed on the basis of something as arbitrary as skin color. And as the final warning was issued to move or face security, his calm resolve was transformed into a defiant promise of ultimate retribution. There would come a time when those who reveled in their unearned superiority would be forced to reckon with the consequences of their tyranny, a reckoning that Marcus intended to deliver with a spectacular flourish that would leave onlookers awestruck and vindicated in their sympathy. This was his moment of transformation, where the bitterness of injustice was to be transmuted into a force of change so mighty that it could only be described as nothing short of revolutionary. In that charged atmosphere of whispered conspiracies and overt hostility, The stage was set for a showdown that transcended the boundaries of a simple flight dispute. It was a battle for dignity, for equality, and for the very soul of a society long marred by systemic prejudice. And as the first-class cabin bore silent witness to this historic clash, Marcus Washington vowed that no matter the cost, his response would be as grand as it was unyielding. A response that would forever echo in the halls of history as a triumph over injustice and a powerful affirmation of every life that had ever been marginalized. Marcus Washington's ordeal took on an even darker and more charged hue as he was led, head held high but with a burden etched onto his every step, down the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. The stifling atmosphere was thick with suppressed anger and reluctant compliance. As uniformed ground agents appeared and directed him to move toward the rear of the aircraft, Marcus stole a final, pained look around the cabin. Not one passenger dared raise their voice to protest the blatant injustice being meted out before their eyes. Instead, a deafening silence reigned. A silence that spoke of shame, complicity, and an overwhelming fear of rocking the boat in a world where power was concentrated in select, haughty hands. As Marcus picked up his worn leather bag and followed the agents, his posture remained as dignified as ever, despite the weight of humiliation pressing upon him like a vice. The gentle hum of the engines as the plane taxied along the tarmac only underscored the vast gulf between the polished veneer of first-class luxury and the cruel reality of prejudice that lurked behind every enforced rule. Inside, his mind churned with the gravity of the situation. Moments earlier, Natalie, the cold and dismissive flight attendant, had snatched his seat away without even a second thought or verification of his rightful claim. Her actions were not an isolated misstep. They were part of a broader systemic machination, a calculated policy designed not merely to inconvenience him, but to assert a sense of racial superiority and control. As the plane rose into the vast blue yonder, Marcus's ears caught snippets of hushed conversations behind a curtained area that separated business from first class. Two attendants, including Natalie and another male colleague whose face he had not seen before, huddled near the galley. Their conversation was too low for a casual bystander, but the fragments that reached his ears were enough to ignite a flame of bitter indignation. Natalie's voice, though soft, cut like a scalpel as she defended her actions. "I know it wasn't ideal," she had said, her tone defensive and matter-of-fact, "but Brent requested that seat, and when someone like him makes a request, you don't second-guess it." The other attendant's low, bitter reply resonated in Marcus's ears. He had heard him say, "You didn't even check the manifest," as if that absolved him of any wrongdoing. Natalie scoffed, dismissing any concern with a clinical remark that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "You saw him. Do you honestly think the company wants someone like that running next to Brent or the board members?" Her words, cold and systematic, echoed with the poison of institutionalized discrimination. To Marcus, every syllable felt like a dagger, puncturing the fragile veneer of respect that should have come with a paid seat in first class. The conversation continued, each statement more damning than the last, as if the very air in the cabin was steeped in the legacy of discrimination. Natalie's final words in that exchange, "Let's just get through the flight. If he complains, they'll bury it like last time," hammered home the brutal reality that Marcus was not experiencing an isolated incident, but rather a carefully orchestrated act designed to suppress dissent. He realized with sinking clarity that this operation was not a series of random errors, but a well-rehearsed performance of bias. A performance that masked its true intent behind the pretense of customer service protocols and outdated policies. Then, as if the weight of it all needed to be made even more unbearable, a soft yet tremulous voice from an elderly passenger in the aisle broke through the tense murmur of the cabin. This older white gentleman, clad in a conservative suit and pinned with an airline loyalty emblem, held a worn safety card in his hand. With a voice that was both sorrowful and accusatory, he revealed that a similar injustice had befallen a young man just a month ago. a man who had been politely moved from first class to coach under the guise of an upgrade error. The older man's quiet confession painted a picture of an enduring pattern of humiliation and systematic exclusion. I asked about it, he recalled, his eyes narrowing in quiet indignation, and she said it was an upgrade error. Funny how those errors never happened the other way around. His voice trailed off into a heavy silence that spoke volumes, more than any shouted protest could. Marcus listened intently, feeling a deep kinship with the older man's experience. That moment crystallized the understanding that he was not alone in this battle. The injustice inflicted upon him was part of a broader, insidious structure that had silenced many before him. When the elderly man finally met Marcus's gaze, his eyes were filled with a mix of pity, resolve, and a heavy burden of resignation. "Nothing," he said simply after Marcus questioned what had happened next. "That's the point. No one said a word." For Marcus, those few words resonated deeply, encapsulating not just his personal suffering, but the silent suffering of countless souls cast aside by a system that valued image over integrity. As the aircraft began its journey over the Atlantic, the interior returned to a facade of refined calm. First class resumed its gentle rhythm of whispered conversations and the clinking of fine glassware, yet beneath that polished exterior, a slow, insidious unraveling of civility was underway. Marcus could sense it in every hushed word and every strained glance. It was as though the tension that had been building all along was poised to burst forth like static before an unavoidable storm. Then, from somewhere beyond the divider, a voice rose clearly and defiantly, a voice that could not be ignored. Brent Hargrove, reclining comfortably in the seat he had unjustly claimed, let his words cut sharply through the brittle calm of the cabin. "I don't care how much you paid," he declared with an unmistakable tone of superiority. "Sitting next to someone like that, honestly, it ruins the entire feel of the cabin." His words, delivered with an air of smug entitlement and venomous amusement, rang out like a challenge to anyone who dared question his privileged position. To Marcus, every utterance of Brent's was an assault, a brazen, public declaration that his presence was an affront to an unyielding, racially charged hierarchy. The guests around them offered forced chuckles and nervous glances, their laughter a thin veil over the discomfort and fear that simmered beneath. One by one, the passengers distanced themselves, burying their dissent and opting instead for quiet obedience. Yet, in that moment of degraded civility, a black woman sitting just a row behind Marcus leaned forward and whispered with palpable disgust, "Did he really say that?" Marcus nodded, his heart heavy with the recognition that this was but one more crack in the facade of respect and equality that the airline claimed to offer. Marcus's inner turmoil grew as he recalled the hushed directive that had come from Bryce Harmon, the onboard flight manager. A succinct text message had arrived, a message that confirmed every suspicion he held. "Keep first class clear. Let's maintain image, no racial mixing. Too much attention this quarter already." Those cold, calculated words were not simply instructions. They were a manifesto of exclusion, a digital decree that reinforced the notion that some lives were deemed unworthy of the same dignity afforded to others. As Marcus replayed that message over and over in his mind, a controlled yet seething fire began to kindle behind his dark eyes. This was no longer just a fight for his seat. It was a battle against a system that had time and again systematically stripped him of his pride. While Marcus grappled with the weight of each injustice, Brent Hargrove continued to revel in his entitlement. Reclining deeper into his plush seat, Brent nonchalantly swirled his champagne and remarked with disdain, "You'd think people would know their place by now." His voice was laden with a ridiculous self-satisfied arrogance, a reminder that in his eyes, the rules of society were etched in gold for the chosen few. "Money doesn't make you upper class. That comes with breeding," he added, his words as callous as they were calculated to wound. For Marcus, these declarations stung fiercely. They underscored the very essence of the prejudices he had been forced to confront yet again. Throughout the flight, Marcus's thoughts oscillated between the personal humiliation he had suffered and the broader, systemic ramifications of the policies that had been laid bare before him. The cold, dismissive behavior of Natalie and the indifferent compliance of the other attendants served as relentless reminders that for many in this cabin, preserving a so-called image was more critical than upholding basic human decency. He recalled the moment when Natalie had curtly issued the ultimatum to move or face security, a moment that had transformed his quiet defiance into a simmering vow for retribution. That incident, and the cascading events that followed, galvanized him with an acute awareness that change would have to be won through defiant courage and strategic resistance. Even as the flight pressed steadily eastward over the vast Atlantic, Marcus could sense the tension in the cabin shifting. Some passengers tried to drown the discomfort with noise-canceling headphones or forced smiles, while others exchanged furtive glances that spoke of unspoken awareness and shared indignation. One particular glance from a woman in the back, a woman whose eyes shone with quiet defiance and empathy, was enough to make Marcus feel that he was not isolated in his struggle. There was a spark of solidarity in that look, a silent acknowledgement that his plight was not unique, that his suffering mirrored the unvoiced stories of many who had been cast aside by a callous system. Meanwhile, the young attendant Evan, whose earlier moment of courage had been ruthlessly quashed by Natalie's cold reprimand, passed by repeatedly. Each time, his hesitant glances in Marcus's direction betrayed an inner conflict, a struggle between his duty to uphold the oppressive system and his innate sense of right and wrong. There was a palpable sadness in Evan's eyes as he carried out orders that he barely understood himself, orders that dehumanized the very people he was meant to serve. It was as if the entire flight had transformed into a microcosm of a society that had long forgotten the meaning of compassion, where every rule was imbued with the cruel calculus of who deserved dignity and who did not. As the hours ticked by and the majesty of the Atlantic stretched out beneath the aircraft, Marcus sat quietly in his new, unwanted seat in business class. A seat that could never replicate the honor and respect that first class had promised him. With each passing minute, he meticulously recorded every detail in a small, worn notebook, knowing that these observations were not just for him, but for a future where his experience could serve as a catalyst for change. Every whispered conversation, every dismissive gesture, every cold, calculated message from high above, all of it painted a stark portrait of a system steeped in institutional racism, and as he wrote, he felt a steady resolve taking root within him. This was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a grand design for retribution, for a comeback that would challenge the very foundations of the elitist order he had just witnessed. Marcus was not content to simply endure the indignity of being moved like a pawn in a callous game. He was quietly plotting his next move, his mind racing with plans on how to transform his personal humiliation into a resounding statement against discrimination. As the cabin's ambient noise ebbed and flowed, he began to realize that his struggle extended far beyond a mere dispute over seat assignments. It was about dignity, about the right to be seen and heard, about rejecting a system that thrived on dehumanizing rules and policies. The insights he gleaned from the hushed exchanges between the attendants and the piercing revelations of the text message were now fuel for his own transformation. Each injustice had become a stepping stone toward a grander act of retribution. A retribution so carefully orchestrated that it would leave the perpetrators and everyone who had silently complicit in the injustice utterly dumbfounded. In that moment, as the plane soared over the vast, endless ocean, Marcus Washington silently vowed that he would not let the weight of prejudice crush his spirit. The embers of anger that flickered in his heart were fanned into a steady blaze, a blaze that promised not only personal vindication, but a challenge to an entire system that sought to keep people like him silent. He remembered the look in Natalie's eyes, the smug assurance in Brent Hargrove's tone, and even the regretful, burdened gaze of the elderly man who had once served on an advisory board. All these fragments of injustice melded into a singular, powerful determination. He knew that his response had to be as bold and majestic as the wrongs he had endured. In a society that so brazenly wielded privilege as a weapon, Marcus realized that only a response of equally grand scale could begin to tip the scales toward justice. The coming hours promised to be a crucible in which his courage would be tested to its limits. Marcus resolved that he would gather every ounce of dignity, every scrap of strength, and channel it into a counterstrike that would force the powers that be to reckon with the human cost of their prejudiced policies. He envisioned a future where his experience, recorded meticulously in his notebook and etched into his memory, would spark a transformation in which the oppressive, unwritten rules that governed privileged spaces would be exposed and dismantled piece by piece until every passenger in a first-class cabin felt the unequivocal commitment to equality and respect. The tension in the cabin continued to simmer as passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many of them now aware of the injustice but too fearful or too conditioned to challenge it openly. Even as the flight advanced steadily into its long haul across the Atlantic, a quiet revolution began to take shape within Marcus. His mind raced with ideas of how to leverage the power of public opinion, how to craft his narrative into a force that could not be ignored, a narrative so potent that it would leave those responsible for his humiliation scrambling to contain a backlash they had never anticipated. Every detail was being cataloged meticulously in his notebook. The voice that insisted on no racial mixing, the dismissive sneers, the unchallenged whispers of compliance. Each detail was a spark that would fuel his eventual retort, a retort destined to send shockwaves far beyond the cramped confines of the airplane cabin. Even as the chatter of forced politeness and corporate jargon droned on, Marcus remained utterly focused on his inner resolve. He no longer saw Natalie merely as an agent of an indifferent policy, nor did he view Brent Hargrove solely as the embodiment of crude entitlement. To him, they were symbols of an entire system built on centuries of bias and cruelty. That system, he vowed silently, would soon be forced to answer for every life it had diminished. The transformation was already underway in his heart. The indignities he had suffered were morphing into a potent catalyst for revolution. A revolution that would shake the foundations of not just the airline industry, but the very notion of class and race that had been used to divide people for generations. As the flight entered the final phases of its transatlantic journey, the atmosphere was heavy with expectancy. The quiet compliance of the other passengers was no longer a sign of acceptance, but a mournful admission of defeat. Yet within that sea of resignation, Marcus felt the stirrings of solidarity, the intangible bond formed by shared suffering, and a secret hope for a better, fairer future. Every resentful glance, every moment of silent empathy was a promise, an unspoken pledge that one day those who had been marginalized would rise and reclaim their dignity. And Marcus Washington, with his quiet determination and steadfast heart, was ready to lead that charge. In the final moments of that turbulent flight, as the roar of the engines provided a backdrop to his fervent thoughts, Marcus closed his eyes for a brief pause. In that quiet moment, he allowed himself to grieve for every injustice he had ever witnessed, every time someone like him was made to feel less than human, but that grief soon hardened into resolve. A resolve to turn the tide, to respond with a magnitude of retribution that would leave the perpetrators and their silent enablers utterly astonished. His story, his struggle, was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun, and its ripples would soon extend far beyond the cramped confines of this flight. For Marcus Washington, this journey was no longer just a physical passage from one destination to another. It was a crucible of change, a defining moment in which he would not be reduced to a mere statistic of discrimination, but would instead become the emblem of resistance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of rampant injustice. As the aircraft continued its eastward flight over the boundless Atlantic, Marcus's mind was alive with visions of a future where the hierarchies of the past crumbled beneath the weight of justice and equality. His inner voice promised that when the time was right, the full force of his retribution would be unleashed with all the dramatic power it demanded. A retribution so magnificent that it would force the entire industry, and perhaps even society at large, to confront the repugnant legacy of racism and reclaim the dignity that had been so callously denied. In that profound silence, as the airplane soared through the endless skies, Marcus realized that his fight was not solely for himself. It was for every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, every soul whose worth had been diminished by arbitrary policies and prejudiced decisions. He recognized that his journey was intertwined with countless others who had faced the same indignities, and that together, their collective voice could shatter the walls of discrimination. That realization made his heart swell with both sorrow and an unyielding determination. In the grand scheme of things, his moment of humiliation was but a spark, and sparks, when gathered, have the power to set ablaze even the most entrenched systems of oppression. By the time the plane began its descent toward its destination, Marcus Washington had resolved that he would not let this injustice fade into another forgotten incident of corporate apathy. Instead, he would transform it into a rallying cry for change, a clarion call that resonated with every soul who had ever been wronged by a biased and deeply flawed system. Every furtive glance, every whispered word of solidarity from behind him, and every cutting remark from those who believed they could dictate who belonged where, would be etched in his memory. And when the time came, Marcus promised himself that he would strike back with a vengeance so grand, so meticulously executed, that it would shake not only the airline industry, but also the very foundations of a society built on exclusion and inequality. As the landing gear lowered and the cabin lights flickered on, Marcus Washington sat quietly, the storm within him quietly gathering force. He understood that his next steps would not be marked by overt confrontation in the narrow confines of a first-class cabin, but by a strategic, deliberate campaign that would bring the hidden truths to light. He would share his story, his painfully detailed account of every slight, every systemic act of prejudice with the world, and in doing so, he would empower others to question the status quo, to demand that fairness and respect be restored where they had long been suppressed. His resolve, once a private flame, was ready to blaze into a beacon of hope and retribution. It was in that charged moment, as the plane began to decelerate and the cabin prepared for disembarkation, that Marcus Washington silently vowed to himself and to every marginalized soul that his fight was far from over. There would come a day when the arrogance of those like Brent Hargrove and the cold indifference of employees like Natalie would no longer go unchallenged. A day would come when the very rules that had been engineered to privilege the few would be exposed for the sham they truly were. And on that day, Marcus intended to lead a revolution so sweeping and magnificent that it would make the halls of justice tremble. A revolution that would rewrite the narrative of discrimination into one of dignity, unity, and unassailable strength. As the aircraft taxied to its gate and passengers began to gather their belongings, a heavy silence lingered in the air, a silence filled with the unspoken promise of change. Marcus Washington gathered his notebook and his strength, each step forward resonating with the determination of a man who had been wronged, yet refused to be broken. His eyes, once soft with the gentle resignation of routine injustice, now burned with the anticipation of a future where retribution was not only inevitable, but also a spectacular testament to the resilience of the human spirit. He stepped off the plane with a quiet dignity that belied the raging storm within him, a storm that would soon burst forth in a manner so grand and unforgettable that even the most entrenched bastions of privilege would be forced to reckon with the consequences of their arrogance. In that final moment, as the airport lights blurred into a hopeful horizon, Marcus Washington held his head high, carrying the collective pain of the past and the promise of a brighter future. The journey ahead was uncertain, and the battle he had chosen was steeped in challenges. But his heart, scarred yet unyielding, was resolute. He would transform every insult, every act of systemic cruelty, into a stepping stone towards justice. And when the time came for his long-awaited, magnificent retribution, it would not only bring down the oppressive forces that had wronged him, but also inspire countless others to stand up and claim the dignity they had long been denied. Thus, as Marcus Washington walked away from that flight, a flight that had become a crucible for understanding the depth of racial injustice and the urgent need for reformation, he carried with him the unquenchable desire to set things right. His story, forged in humiliation and tempered by resolve, would soon echo across boardrooms, newsrooms, and the hearts of every person who had ever wondered why fairness was still such a rare treasure in a world all too familiar with prejudice. And so, with the weight of injustice behind him and hope lighting his path forward, he resolved that his grand retribution would be nothing short of legendary, a moment when the chains of discrimination would finally shatter under the brilliance of truth and the unstoppable force of dignity. Marcus Washington's ordeal continued to intensify, each moment aboard Flight 332 transforming into a crucible of systemic injustice and unrelenting defiance. The atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive as the chain of command closed in on him. Near his row, a young attendant, whose eyes brimmed with guilt and conflicted sorrow, had paused for just a brief second before moving along without further comment. The silent look in his eyes said more than words ever could, a silent confession of the cruelty he was forced to witness and participate in. It was as if the very air in the cabin crackled with the weight of unspoken truths and forgotten promises of dignity. About halfway through the flight, Bryce, a man whose features had been carefully rehearsed to exude authority and preordained hostility, emerged from behind the curtain. He strode purposefully toward Marcus with a face that bore the practiced mask of someone delivering unwelcome news rather than an officer ready to offer a solution. Crouching beside Marcus's seat in an almost pitying manner, Bryce addressed him with a rehearsed politeness that betrayed nothing but disdain. "Mr. Washington," he began with a practiced smile, though it held no warmth, "I need a moment of your time." Marcus offered a slight nod, his expression calm yet betraying a simmering storm beneath his composed exterior. Bryce continued, his tone clipped and clinical as he laid out accusations that reeked of ulterior motives. "We have received a report that your presence in economy after the seating issue has been causing discomfort among our passengers." He spoke as though it were an undeniable fact, his measured diction twisting the situation into something far more sinister than an unfortunate seating error. Marcus's jaw tensed at the insinuation, yet he maintained a level tone, asking quietly, "What exactly did I do to cause this so-called discomfort?" Bryce's eyes remained unflinching as he recited a litany of grievances that Marcus had been seen quietly writing in a notebook, whispering among himself, and questioning staff. All acts painted as deliberate disruption. Marcus could scarcely believe that simple acts of composed resistance, those born out of silent dignity, were being weaponized to justify his removal. He laughed softly, not out of amusement but in disbelief that his quiet composure was being misinterpreted as misconduct. Before Marcus could further defend his honor, Bryce delivered a decision that sent shockwaves through the already charged atmosphere. "In the interest of overall safety and comfort, we have decided to reroute this aircraft for a precautionary deplaning. We will be landing in Shannon, Ireland within 30 minutes. The announcement, made moments later over the PA system in a tone that was clinical and detached, left the cabin engulfed in confusion and whispers. Marcus turned his gaze toward the window, his face a mask of calm determination, even as the fire of indignation blazed beneath. In nearby rows, passengers exchanged muttered remarks. One man asked in disbelief if they were actually kicking Marcus off the flight because of a mere seating error, while another remarked that such a maneuver was less a mistake and more an escalation, a punishment, and a forewarning. It was evident to everyone that this was no ordinary air of miscommunication, but a calculated move meant to strip Marcus of his rightful place. As the minutes ticked by, young Evan, whose earlier moment of moral courage had been swiftly curtailed by Natalie's harsh dismissal, passed by repeatedly. Each time, his hesitant glances in Marcus's direction betrayed a profound internal conflict, a silent struggle between following orders and clinging to the vestiges of decency. Evan's face was etched with sorrow and apprehension, as if each step he took was a betrayal of something far greater than his job. The scene unfolded with heartbreaking clarity as Marcus, ever dignified, rose from his seat. He gathered his battered notebook and his worn coat before walking toward the front of the cabin. His movement was measured and calm, a stark contrast to the turmoil swirling among the passengers. Phones began to emerge in trembling hands, as if those present suddenly questioned whether they had the right or the courage to capture such a profound injustice at 37,000 feet in the air. One college-age woman sitting near the bulkhead did not hesitate. With a mix of shock and resolve, she opened her camera app and recorded Marcus's solemn procession. "They're making him get off the flight," she whispered to her audience, her voice quavering with disbelief at the gravity of the moment. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not offer any threats. He simply continued on with a stoic determination that made it abundantly clear he would not be broken by this orchestrated humiliation. Within minutes, the live stream, raw and unedited, began to gain traction. What started with a few hundred viewers swelled into 20,000, then 300,000, and ultimately, by the time the aircraft touched down, over 1 million viewers had witnessed this modern injustice. Hashtags like Marcus Washington, Flight 332, and Flying While Black began trending across social media platforms, their digital resonance echoing the silent rage of countless hearts. Inside the terminal, just as Marcus was being escorted through a private side door by uniformed Irish security, Bryce made another fatal mistake. In a tone meant to silence dissent and preserve the status quo, he declared loudly and clearly to the local agents, "Better to deal with this now before he causes a scene." An Irish officer, his expression one of bemused incredulity, remarked in a low, knowing tone, "He is the calmest one in the room, mate," even as the passengers in the cabin remained unsettled and mired in a collective sense of injustice. The once unassailable Brent Hargrove reclined further into his coveted seat, 1A. He swirled a fresh pour of champagne, the smirk on his face broadening as he observed the spectacle of a man being removed simply for asserting his rights. With the entire aircraft idling on the runway, Brent's voice rang out across the cabin, his tone arrogant and dismissive. "Honestly," he declared loudly, "the whole flight feels lighter without that kind of tension on board. I did not sign up to share this space with people who bring courtroom energy into a luxury environment." Nearby passengers exchanged looks of discomfort and disapproval, their silent protests lost in the echo of Brent's entitlement. Brent was quick to add, his voice oozing condescension, "Of course it's not about race, it's about class. Some people just don't understand how to behave at this level." His words, intended to reaffirm his own superiority, only deepened the chasm of injustice. Young Evan, still working the aisle with visibly trembling hands, caught every word. His discomfort was undeniable, a mirror of the collective soul of those who sensed that such blatant disregard for dignity could no longer be tolerated. Evan briefly peered over the galley curtain and, in a hushed tone, asked Natalie if she had heard Brent's callous remarks. Natalie, her eyes fixed on restocking the snack drawer with cold detachment, responded curtly, "Don't get involved, just finish the service and keep moving." Yet Brent, intoxicated by his own perceived invincibility, was far from finished. With a deliberate flair that bordered on theatrical, Brent lifted his glass in what can only be described as an insolent toast. "Long may it last," he proclaimed, as if to honor the natural order of things, a twisted order that placed wealth and breeding above basic human decency. At that very moment, Marcus's live stream, still being recorded by the determined college student, reached a staggering 2 million views. The digital world exploded as the truth of what had transpired high in the skies spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed relentlessly. Threads on Twitter, posts on Reddit, and countless TikTok stitches turned his ordeal into a movement. Hashtags such as Justice for Marcus, Vipa Wild Black, and Flight 31322 Shame were plastered across countless screens, each one serving as a clarion call against the entrenched racism that had dared to humiliate Marcus Washington. Brent, oblivious to the digital storm gathering, continued to sip his champagne as if his universe was unchallenged, his authority absolute and untouchable. However, the tide began to shift. As the ground crew worked diligently to refuel the aircraft and recheck cargo, the cabin lights blinked once before settling into an uneasy steadiness. A new voice crackled over the crew channel, and Bryce leaned into his earpiece, his expression shifting subtly as he absorbed the incoming message. His brow furrowed in dismay and disbelief as he listened. Wordlessly, Bryce stood erect and strode quickly toward the cockpit, a move that did nothing to quell the rising storm but instead signaled that even those complicit in the original injustice were beginning to sense the inevitable consequences of their actions. At that exact moment, Natalie's phone vibrated sharply in her blazer pocket. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out and scanned the urgent message. The screen flashed an alert that read, "Black executive removed from first class on Flight 332. Sources claim racial targeting." The message wasn't just a trending topic, it had ignited the pages of national news outlets. A photo of Marcus Washington, calm despite being escorted by Irish security, had become the face of an outrage that demanded accountability. Natalie's hands trembled as the harsh reality of the unfolding scandal began to sink in. Meanwhile, as if summoned by the weight of mounting injustice, the curtain in the first-class cabin parted once more. Marcus reappeared, his composure unmarred by the humiliation he had endured. He stepped forward with a presence that spoke not only of personal resilience, but also of an unyielding force reclaiming what had been taken from him. No longer was he simply a passenger wronged by discriminatory policy. He had transformed into a living symbol of retribution. A palpable hush swept through the cabin as Brent's confident demeanor faltered. His champagne glass paused midway to his lips, while his eyes searched in disbelief at the man who had once been forcibly removed. He paused, listening intently for confirmation before adding in a voice that was cold and resolute, "They tried to humiliate their new owner, Madeir, and that will not go unanswered." As his message echoed through the cabin, the stunned silence was broken only by the sound of stunned whispers and the rustle of shuffling papers. Passengers sat frozen while Brent shrank back in his seat, his earlier bravado now replaced by a dawning realization that his world was unraveling. Natalie's face was ashen as she processed the enormity of what was unfolding, while young Evan continued to navigate the aisle with trembling hands, each step laden with regret and apprehension. The cabin was now a theater of upheaval, every passenger a reluctant witness to the exacting moment when the entrenched order began to crumble. Social media was already ablaze outside, and with every second that ticked by, Marcus Washington's quiet retribution was gathering momentum. With his live broadcast now reaching millions around the globe, the narrative had shifted irreversibly. Hashtag after hashtag, Justice for Marcus, Atlantic Air Shame, and Atlantic Honor Racism sprang up on timelines across the country, each one a digital echo of the injustice Marcus had so courageously endured. The very foundations of Atlantic Air, built on the legacy of elitism and discriminatory practices, were now under siege from an unexpected source: a man who had refused to be silenced. As the voices of outraged passengers and social media users coalesced into a deafening roar of support, Marcus's determined stride never faltered. His calm and measured expression told the world that while his physical removal from first class had been forced upon him, his spirit remained indomitable. Every step he took toward the deplaning area was not just a step toward reclaiming his dignity, but a stride toward dismantling a system that had long denied him and so many others the respect they deserved. The pain and humiliation he had suffered were now being transformed into an unstoppable force for change. At that defining moment, as the Irish ground crew prepared to usher him out of the aircraft, Marcus turned one last time to face the stunned faces of those who had, until now, chosen silence over solidarity. His eyes filled with the steadfast certainty of a man who had seen too much suffering and injustice, sparkled with an intensity that left no room for doubt. He spoke softly, yet every word carried the weight of his resolve. "You have underestimated the power of a quiet man with an unyielding heart," he said. "Today, you see not only the true meaning of justice, but the beginning of a revolution built on the foundation of dignity, resilience, and the refusal to be invisible." His words, powerful and imbued with the lived reality of every wronged soul, resonated deeply within every observer. Brent Hargrove's earlier scoffs and condescending remarks now seemed feeble echoes in the face of such unwavering conviction. The live feed capturing each tear, each determined glance, and each whispered word of solidarity reverberated far beyond the confines of the aircraft. It became a rallying cry for justice in a world too long divided by prejudice. As the aircraft finally began its final descent into Shannon, Marcus Washington's thoughts raced ahead to the future. He envisioned a day when every boarding pass, every seat assignment, every policy in the world of aviation and beyond would be free of the stain of discrimination. His live broadcast was not merely a recounting of humiliation, but a carefully documented blueprint of a movement that would force accountability from those who had long thrived on the silent oppression of others. With every passing minute, the promise of change edged closer, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. In the hushed corridors of the terminal, as Marcus was finally led through a private door and into the waiting arms of the global community, the story of his defiant stand became an allegory for every person whose life had been marred by the pervasive injustice of a system that valued wealth and heritage over human dignity. His actions that day promised retribution and a future where discrimination was not tolerated, a future where every wrong would be righted by the force of truth and solidarity. Marcus Washington, once reduced to a silent figure in a luxurious cabin, had transformed into a beacon of resistance, a man whose quiet strength had stirred a tumult of change that could no longer be ignored. His journey was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. With each meticulously noted detail in his well-worn notebook, he prepared to unveil a story that would shatter the comfortable illusions of privilege and expose the ugly realities hidden beneath. His retribution, crafted with the precision of a seasoned strategist, would shake not only the aviation industry, but also the very societal structures that had enabled such injustice to flourish. As the terminal bustled with activity and news channels began covering the unfolding saga, every passenger and onlooker was left with one indelible message: that the time for silent suffering was over, and the age of righteous retribution had begun. Marcus's struggle, wrought from personal humiliation and systemic cruelty, was now the spark that would set ablaze a movement for justice that resounded across every corner of a nation. An unwavering call for a society built on equality, respect, and the unassailable dignity of every human being. Thus, as Marcus Washington stood at the threshold of a new era, a moment that would soon be etched into the annals of history as a turning point in the fight against discrimination, he carried with him not only the memory of the pain inflicted upon him, but also the promise of a future where every injustice would be met with a resounding, magnificent response, a response so grand and so transformative that even those who had once dared to mock his quiet strength would be forced to confront the undeniable truth. That true power lies not in wealth or entitlement, but in the unyielding resolve of a spirit that refuses to bow to prejudice. In that charged final moment aboard Flight 332, with the lights of Shannon Airport beckoning and the world watching in awe, Marcus Washington silently vowed that he would not rest until every cornerstone of discrimination was dismantled. His journey, now immortalized in the collective consciousness of a global community, was a testament to the relentless pursuit of justice and a promise that one day the chains of oppression would crumble beneath the brilliant weight of truth, unity, and dignity. Marcus Washington's saga had reached a boiling point that none aboard Flight 332 could ignore. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a living testament to a corporate drama unfolding in real time. A drama grounded in the harsh reality of systemic racism and gross abuse of power, rather than fiction. Every eye in the cabin was fixed on the unfolding scene, where power was being realigned before their very eyes. Marcus, who had already endured the indignities of being stripped of his rightful first-class seat, now stood at the center of a storm that would forever alter the landscape of Atlantic air. At one point, a young attendant, barely old enough to shoulder the heavy expectations of his role, stood off to the side with a frozen expression. His eyes, wide with a mixture of guilt and helplessness, silently confessed everything he could not say aloud. It was a look that spoke volumes. A soul burdened by the weight of his complicity in an unfolding injustice he wished he could stop. Every detail seemed orchestrated, every moment a part of a cruel performance, designed not to serve any passenger but to maintain an age-old hierarchy where race dictated worth. Then, roughly halfway through the flight, Bryce emerged from behind the curtain with a strut that was meant to exude confidence, but instead betrayed the anxiety of a man delivering unpleasant news. His face was carefully rehearsed for conflict as he made his way purposefully toward Marcus. Crouching beside Marcus's seat in a patronizing manner, Bryce addressed him with a rehearsed politeness that masked a deep-seated disdain. "Mr. Washington," he said, voice void of warmth, "I need a moment of your time." Marcus merely gave a slight nod, his face calm, yet his eyes burning with a determination that belied his inner turmoil. Bryce continued in a clipped, businesslike tone, as though reciting from a memo. He accused Marcus of having created a disturbing atmosphere and economy following the seating debacle. According to Bryce, Marcus's quiet behavior, writing in his notebook, whispering and questioning the staff, had apparently unsettled other passengers. His words were delivered as if they were incontrovertible facts, erasing all context of dignity and respect. Marcus's jaw tightened, yet he maintained a steady cadence as he calmly inquired, "What exactly did I do to cause discomfort?" His tone was measured, even in the face of such baseless accusations. Bryce did not flinch as he listed the alleged offenses, painting a picture of a man who had turned a simple act of recording his experience into a deliberate disruption. Then, before Marcus could interject further, Bryce dropped the bombshell. "In the interests of overall safety and comfort," he announced, "we have decided to reroute this aircraft for a precautionary deplaning. We will be landing at Shannon Airport in Ireland within 30 minutes. The announcement came over the PA system in a detached, almost clinical cadence that left no room for debate. The cabin was filled with murmurs of disbelief, whispers that questioned whether a simple seating error was truly worth such an escalation. Marcus turned his gaze toward the window, his face the picture of calm resolve, though a raging fire of indignation burned beneath his cool exterior. Nearby, a man 2 rows back muttered incredulously to his seatmate, "Are they really kicking him off?" Another voice replied that it wasn't just a mistake. It was a calculated punishment, a warning. It was clear to everyone this was not an unfortunate error, but an orchestrated maneuver to humiliate him and assert a racially charged hierarchy. Young Evan, the attendant whose earlier moment of moral courage had been stifled by Natalie's cold orders, passed by again. His eyes, filled with conflicted remorse, betrayed a silent acknowledgement of the pain of the injustice unfolding. Every hesitant glance he spared Marcus was a reminder that even those caught in the machinery of oppression yearned for a more compassionate way of working. But the system was relentless, and Evan, despite his inner turmoil, had little choice but to obey orders. With quiet dignity, Marcus rose from his reassigned seat, gathering his battered notebook and worn coat. He walked steadily toward the front of the cabin, each step measured, each movement full of the resolve of a man determined not to be crushed by injustice. As he moved, passengers began to subtly pull out their phones. It was as if they were uncertain whether they had the right to record this extraordinary display of corporate cruelty at 37,000 feet above ground. Among them was a college-age woman sitting by the bulkhead who did not hesitate to open her camera app. In a hushed tone that trembled with disbelief, she narrated to her live stream. "They're making him get off the flight." Her voice, raw and earnest, resonated with a mix of shock and indignation, capturing every moment of Marcus's dignified protest. Within minutes, the live stream's viewer count skyrocketed from a few hundred to over 1 million, as the footage, raw and unedited, spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags like Marcus Washington, Flight 332, and Flying While Black began trending, each tag igniting a spark of collective outrage and support among viewers all around the world. The world outside the plane was watching, and with every passing second, the truth of Marcus's experience was reaching an ever-widening audience. Inside the terminal, as Marcus was escorted through a private side door by uniformed Irish security, Bryce made an error that would haunt him. Loud enough for nearby agents to hear, Bryce said, "Better to deal with this now before he causes a scene." An Irish officer, with a wry, matter-of-fact tone, remarked quietly, "He is the calmest one in the room, mate." Even as the passengers sat in stunned silence, Brent Hargrove reclined further into his prize seat 1A, with a fresh pour of champagne in hand and a smirk that attempted to mask his underlying arrogance. Brent's voice rang out across the cabin. "Honestly," he said loudly enough for every nearby row to hear, "the whole flight already feels lighter without that kind of tension on board. I didn't sign up to share my space with people who bring courtroom energy into a luxury environment." His words, dripping with entitlement and disdain, earned forced chuckles and uncomfortable glances from those around him. Brent wasn't finished. With deliberate theatricality, he added, "Of course, it isn't about race, it's about class. Some people simply do not know how to behave at this level." His remarks, laced with condescension and steeped in elitism, struck at the heart of the injustice Marcus had suffered. Even young Evan, who continued his work down the aisle with visibly trembling hands, absorbed every word. His discomfort was palpable, his face a mirror of the deep-seated remorse and conflict that churned within him. The air in the cabin had turned electric with the realization that this was no longer about a simple miscommunication. It was about centuries of discrimination and an entrenched system built on the repudiation of dignity. As the minutes passed, the tension deepened. The live stream continued to break records, and every frame captured the silent defiance of Marcus Washington as he was escorted toward the front. At one point, as he reached the galley area, his resolve seemed to coalesce into a powerful presence that demanded respect. He looked directly at Bryce and with a voice that was both calm and searingly potent said, "You removed me from my seat, denied my identity, and endorsed a racial hierarchy under your company's protocol. That is going to cost you more than just your job." For a long, charged moment, Bryce opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, the crackle of his headset filled the tension-laden silence. He pressed the earpiece, listened for a moment, and his face drained further as an urgent legal alert from corporate headquarters flashed across his screen, marked high priority. At that moment, Brent finally found his voice, though it wavered with uncertainty as he asked, "What exactly are you saying? Is this some kind of revenge stunt?" Marcus turned fully to face Brent, stepping squarely into his line of sight with an authority that brooked no challenge. "I am saying that the airline you think caters to you," he declared, "belongs to me." The shock on Brent's face was unmistakable as Marcus continued, his tone steady and laden with the gravity of truth. Volta Capital now owns 51% of Atlantic Air's voting shares as of just 2 days ago. I signed the final acquisition papers in Zurich. I kept my identity hidden in order to test the cultural temperature of this flight, your flight, and you failed, spectacularly. Marcus's voice grew firmer as he turned toward Natalie, whose earlier attempts to rationalize the situation with bureaucratic cliches had proven hollow. "You didn't even ask for my name," he said, voice rising ever so slightly. "You assumed I didn't belong. You moved me without due process, insulted me without knowing who I was, and enabled this man's racist tirade in front of the entire cabin." Natalie tried to steady her voice, but it trembled, and before she could offer a feeble defense, Marcus interjected sharply, "Your protocol is nothing but prejudice in disguise, and now it is documented, live-streamed, and tied to an executive shareholder lawsuit." His words echoed through the cabin, leaving no doubt that the time for silent endurance was over. Back on the aircraft, as Marcus calmly returned to the seat he had originally paid for, seat 1A, the air of authority around him was palpable. Every eye in the cabin turned toward him, not with judgment, but with silent respect and awe. It was as if the passengers, who had once been complicit in their own silence, now recognized that they had misread the true meaning of dignity. Across the cabin, Brent Hargrove sat frozen. Gone was the arrogant, self-assured man who had boasted moments earlier about his power. He now appeared as nothing more than a symbol of the toxicity that had precipitated this dramatic fall. Unbeknownst to the occupants of the cabin, the financial fallout outside was even more catastrophic. As Marcus's command to initiate Clause 7C spread through the vast network of Volta Capital, internal systems began liquidating Atlantic Air Holdings with the precision of a well-oiled machine. At exactly 11:41 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time, financial terminals in London and New York lit up in red. Automated trades were executed at lightning speed, sending shockwaves through global markets. Brokers were the first to notice the massive, unexpected volume of share dumping. Within 90 seconds, Atlantic Air's stock had plummeted 12%, and in a matter of minutes, it had tumbled by a staggering 27%. The rapid fall left market anchors scrambling to analyze the chaos, and analysts could only watch in disbelief as the full picture became alarmingly clear when Volta Capital issued a terse statement. Due to an egregious violation of operational ethics and a breach of equity trust, Volta Capital has severed ties with Atlantic Air, effective immediately. Within minutes of that declaration, headlines flashed across the globe. By 11:49 a.m., Bloomberg reported a stunning headline: "CEO ejected from his own seat, $500 million, 0 cents in value wiped out in under 10 minutes. CNN soon followed with a banner reading, "Corporate meltdown at 37 feet, racial profiling sparks financial catastrophe." Screens in airport lounges abruptly switched from sports highlights to urgent breaking news, and CNBC's ticker flashed live footage captured by the college student streaming Marcus's removal alongside a plunging stock market indicator. Social media exploded. Hashtags such as Coal Clapback, Flight 332, and Power in Silence began trending globally. An activist investor named Sean Laramie tweeted, "Never underestimate a black man in a tailored suit, especially when he signs your paycheck," summing up the sentiment of millions who were watching and rallying behind Marcus Washington's cause. Meanwhile, inside Atlantic Air's Manhattan headquarters, panic reigned. Conference calls buzzed, legal teams scrambled, and board members, panic-stricken and desperate for answers, faced the reality that their company was now in the throes of a monumental crisis. Back aboard the plane, as Natalie huddled in the galley on a cold steel storage crate, her face lit by the glare of her phone, she watched in dismay as her own image trended in a viral thread titled "The Face of Corporate Disgrace." Young Evan, still at the end of the aisle, seemed paralyzed, caught between the roles he was forced to play and the gravity of what was unfolding before him. Bryce, whose earlier confidence had evaporated, now received a dire message on his tablet. His face paled, beads of sweat on his brow, as the legal fallout escalated. His once indomitable presence was crumbling under the weight of responsibility and impending consequence. As Marcus joined the small gathering outside the jet bridge, a collective murmur of solidarity arose. His quiet defiance, so painstakingly documented and broadcast for the world to see, resonated deeply with every onlooker. In that moment, the trivialities of luxury and entitlement that had governed Atlantic Air's operations were laid bare. Here, in the aftermath of a reckoning that began at 37,000 feet, the call for a more equitable and humane society echoed in every whispered conversation and every shared glance of solidarity. For Marcus Washington, this was not merely an act of retribution. It was a clarion call to dismantle a rotten system, a moment that symbolized the relentless spirit of every individual who had ever been diminished by bias. His message was clear: accountability was no longer optional, and the legacy of discrimination would be met with an unwavering response. As news of the corporate meltdown and the financial catastrophe rippled through major networks, Atlantic Air's outdated practices and elitist policies were exposed for the scandal they truly were. Inside the terminal, as the chaos of media crews and corporate executives converged, Marcus's calm demeanor remained unshaken. His defiant stand had turned him from a mere passenger into a figure of monumental change, a beacon of hope that illuminated the possibility of a future where every person's dignity was respected, regardless of their race or background. His battle was far from over, but the reverberations of his actions promised a new era of accountability, reform, and justice that would extend far beyond the walls of an airplane cabin. In that final chapter of the flight, as the curtains of corporate deceit were lifted and the real story was broadcast for a global audience, Marcus Washington's voice, quiet yet unyielding, carried a powerful message to all who had suffered under the weight of prejudice. His journey had been one of humiliation and injustice, but it had also been a crucible where his strength and resolve were forged anew. Today, he stood not merely as a victim of systemic cruelty, but as an agent of transformative change, one who had the courage to challenge the status quo and demand that every act of discrimination be met with a resounding, magnificent reckoning. Thus, as Marcus Washington stepped forward into a future brimming with uncertainty, yet illuminated by the promise of justice, he carried with him not only the scars of his past, but also the hope of a revolution that would one day dismantle every vestige of oppression. His story would echo through boardrooms, legal corridors, and the hearts of every person who believed in the power of dignity and equality. And in that echo, the age of silent suffering was finally giving way to an era where accountability and retribution would ensure that no injustice, no matter how deeply entrenched, could ever go unchallenged again. Marcus Washington's journey reached its final crescendo as airline personnel in stiff suits and uneasy smiles gathered in the terminal. A woman named Lena Caro, newly appointed Crisis VP for Atlantic Air, stepped forward with a steady but weighted tone. "Mr. Washington, on behalf of the company, I want to offer our full apology and cooperation. We acknowledge the serious errors committed during this flight." Marcus merely nodded and walked past them with unwavering purpose. He had no need for their empty contrition. Behind him, passengers murmured about the spectacle they had witnessed. A retired lawyer from Brussels was already drafting a column titled, "The Day Power Boarded the Plane Last," and the college student who live-streamed every moment now enjoyed over 8 million views, along with offers from national news outlets. In private terminals, CEOs took notes while airline competitors held emergency calls. As the aftershocks rippled beyond Zurich, the story of quiet discrimination had transformed into a global case study in systemic failure, corporate arrogance, and unexpected justice. Meanwhile, Marcus's courage sparked an internal revolution. Anonymous reporting lines, thorough audits, and reformed hiring practices. At a small Newark ceremony honoring true leadership, Marcus stated simply, "Power is proven not by how loudly you speak, but by what you choose to fix when no one is looking." This powerful rebuke turned personal insult into lasting structural change.